just to kind of go through what each of our days will look like. Kind of that just brief overview to start is that our program is designed based on that design thinking framework. So each day aligns with a different step of design thinking. So day 1, empathy; day 2, define; day 3, ideate; day 4, prototype; and day 5, test. And so during this time, each day, students will go through each of those steps in order to find a way to address a critical issue around the world, not just one that affects Mongolia, but that affects the whole world, but specifically to Mongolia, access to education. So on day 1, we'll start off with introductions. After we go through those, we'll set some expectations just to make sure that we're all on the same page as we're going through the program. And then from there, we'll get into the nitty gritty. Our lovely team here will do a presentation as interactive and as engaging as possible, but so that students really get an understanding of what access to education looks like in Mongolia, some of the history behind it, some of the current events, maybe some of the things that people have tried to do or say they're doing, but actually aren't working or aren't really being done. So they'll get into a lot more detail on that, so that students can kind of get that major overview, and then they'll do a nice funnel into a relatively more specific community, like Anya said. So that time is a really great opportunity for students to really engage with questions. And so that is that main part of day 1, is that presentation. And so after the presentation, we will send the supplemental work. So every day that supplemental work will look a little different. We send some before day 1 as well. It includes just some information for students to kind of get a firsthand look into what design thinking is. So some TED Talks, some other informational videos, and then each day the supplemental work that we send is about an hour long to complete. But it looks different every day. Some days it's more article driven, some days it's a bit more research driven. Some days it's some videos, some days we ask them to reflect, go on a walk. So it'll be a little different every day. Something that I've talked to some of the teachers about so far is that this program really focuses on one specific topic in each country, and not so much a focus on cultural aspects or language or super specific historical activity or events. And so from some of the teachers that I spoke with, their extra 2 hours that they have with students, that'll be a really great time for students to kind of delve into that information. And then they're welcome to bring up questions and stuff that they have with our team the next day from what they've learned. Just as a nice little side note. So day 2 is about defining what our specific issue is. So again, access to education in Mongolia, access to education in general, both are just major topics that span various issues. But with design thinking, the idea is to make the issue a little bit better to deal with, kind of step at a time. And so what we do is focus in on one specific part of that bigger issue to address. So in day 2, we kind of go through that process. We'll do an activity called Cultural Suitcase. So students kind of get an idea of their own identity and their own culture to kind of, again, try to hone in on that empathy aspect of design thinking. Another quick little expectation setting. We'll do an activity called the Design Thinking 100-meter sprint, which goes through the design thinking process, each 5 steps, in about 15 to 20 minutes in a way that kind of more directly relates to the students' lives, so that they kind of get a better understanding of just what that method looks like. And after we do the 100-meter sprint, then we jump into what we call empathy interviews. So we just kind of understood what the design thinking process looks like as a whole. And then we try to jump back to access to education in Mongolia. So relating it back to ourselves, trying to connect with that topic as much as possible in order to really empathize with it to make that definition. And so after the empathy interviews, we will then actually get into creating the definition, where students will address what they believe from what they've learned from our team, what they believe the heart of the issue is. And from understanding what that is, kind of identifying it as a team, then we create our definition, trying to narrow in on that kind of more specific issue within access to education in Mongolia. And once we have that definition, then that is the end of day 2. Any questions so far before I jump ahead? All good, cool. And so then we go to day 3, which is to ideate. This is the main part of day 3. We will start with an activity called the privilege talk. It's our version of the virtual walk that you would typically do where students move forward, but we have our virtual version. That's definitely been very insightful for students. I really appreciate this activity. So we'll do that activity. It'll be followed with a debrief, and then we'll jump back into the topic. So access to education, and create what we call how might we questions. So these are our design questions, and they allow us to kind of call for that solution. It doesn't bring it upon us, but it allows us to kind of easily go to that next step. Again, design thinking is a lovely process, and so we got to go step by step. So we'll make how might we questions that again take that narrowed down definition and kind of narrow it down even a little further to figure out what a specific productive, sustainable solution could look like. So students will kind of go through this process of making how might we questions, identifying specific stakeholders, specific locations, and specific actions that we want to take in order to address this issue, combine them into an organized, productive way, and that will create our how might we question, which then will essentially call for that solution, as I mentioned. Once we have a few of those narrowed down and we picked our best, we'll do an evaluation of those questions and kind of the prototypes that they call for. And then that will be the end of day 3. And day 4 starts with a local stakeholder. So we'll have a guest that day as well, another expert in the field of access to education in Mongolia. Students will have the opportunity to express what they've learned so far and explain what they've come up with as far as how might we questions and their ideas for moving forward to their solutions. And so the point of the local stakeholder is to kind of, one, encourage students to really think deeper whenever their prototype ideas are, acknowledging what is actually realistic in Mongolian culture, encouraging sustainability, making sure it's human-centered, and kind of just honing in, again, on that empathy aspect of design thinking. So students have that time with them, about half an hour, 45 minutes to really ask their questions. And then they jump into what we call rapid prototyping. So students will spend pretty much the rest of day 4 actually creating their presentation that they want to show on day 5. This is also something that they'll be able to work on after we leave as well. We definitely encourage creativity in really making a unique presentation. So it could be a fun little challenge for them to kind of take up some of that extra time as well for teachers. So once they finish day 4, day 5 is that test of design thinking. So they will give their presentations to a group of panelists who will join for that 5th day from Rustic Pathways. And so students will have a chance to actually express what they've learned, why they came up with this idea, and then really give a nice follow-up with exactly what their solution is. And we will give them feedback, ask them questions, encourage them to kind of explain really what it is that brought them to this, and how they kind of see this moving forward in the future. And then after each group has presented, each group has been provided with feedback, then we leave the program leaders to have their final goodbyes with the students. And that's the end of Global Issues Design Challenge, a very brief overview.